Girl asks to sit in back of bus daily. Driver follows her home and can't believe it. The yellow school bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, its brakes hissing like an old man's labored breathing. Frank Morrison adjusted his rearview mirror and watched as a familiar figure approached through the morning fog that hung thick over the Ohio suburbs. Emma Thompson walked with her head down, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the other strap dangling loose like a broken wing. "Morning, Emma," Frank called out as she climbed the 3 rubber-treaded steps, her worn sneakers making barely a sound. She didn't respond, just gave him that same slight nod she'd been giving him for the past 2 years. Her blonde hair, once probably bright and full of life, hung in greasy strands around her pale face. The oversized hoodie she wore looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks, and Frank noticed a new tear near the left pocket that hadn't been there yesterday. "Back seat, please," Emma whispered, her voice so soft that Frank had to strain to hear her over the rumble of the engine. It was always the same request. Always the back seat. Always as far away from everyone else as possible. Frank watched in his mirror as Emma made her way down the narrow aisle, past the chattering groups of kids who barely acknowledged her existence. She slid into the very last seat on the right side, pressed herself against the window, and pulled her hood up despite the warming October air. The bus lurched forward, and Frank began his familiar route through the suburban streets of Millbrook, Ohio. This was his 23rd year driving for the district, and he'd seen thousands of kids come and go. Most were forgotten within a semester, but Emma Thompson had lodged herself in his mind like a splinter he couldn't quite remove. "Yo, Frank, can you turn up the heat back here?" shouted Marcus Jenkins, a lanky 8th grader who always sat in the middle section with his crew of friends. "It's not even cold, Marcus," Frank replied, glancing at the temperature gauge. "October in Ohio, you should be used to this by now." The kids laughed, and Marcus launched into some story about his weekend football game. Frank half listened, but his attention kept drifting to his rearview mirror, where he could see Emma's reflection in the window. She was staring out at the passing houses, her breath fogging the glass in small rhythmic puffs. 3 stops later, the Thompson boy got on. Jake Thompson was Emma's older brother, a sophomore with the kind of confident swagger that came naturally to kids who played varsity sports. He was everything Emma wasn't: popular, loud, seemingly without a care in the world. Frank watched as Jake high-fived his friends and slid into a seat near the front, never once looking back at his sister. It struck Frank as odd, the way the siblings completely ignored each other. In his years of driving, he'd seen plenty of brothers and sisters who pretended not to know each other at school, but there was usually some acknowledgement, some small sign of their connection. With Emma and Jake, there was nothing. It was as if they existed in completely separate worlds. The bus pulled into Lincoln Middle School's circular drive, and Frank opened the doors with a pneumatic hiss. The kids filed out in their usual chaotic manner, shouting goodbyes and making plans for after school. Jake bounded down the steps with his friends, his gym bag bouncing against his hip. Emma was always the last to leave. She waited until every other student had exited before she slowly made her way to the front of the bus. As she passed Frank's seat, he caught a whiff of something he couldn't quite identify. Not just the usual teenage mix of cheap deodorant and hormones, but something else, something that made his stomach tighten with unease. "Have a good day, Emma," Frank said, trying to inject some warmth into his voice. She paused at the top of the steps and looked back at him. For just a moment, her hood slipped back, and Frank saw her face clearly. There was a faint, yellow-green bruise along her jawline, mostly hidden by makeup that had been applied with the inexpert hand of someone too young to really know what they were doing. "Thanks, Mr. Morrison," she whispered, and then she was gone, disappearing into the stream of students flowing toward the school's entrance. Frank sat in his empty bus for a long moment, the engine idling as he processed what he'd seen. In 23 years, he'd learned to read the signs. The kids who were struggling at home, the ones who were being bullied, the ones who just needed someone to notice them. Emma Thompson was sending up more red flags than a hurricane warning, but Frank wasn't sure what to do about it. The radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, you're running behind schedule. Everything okay?" Frank picked up the handset. "All good, dispatch. Just finishing up at Lincoln, heading to Route 2 now." But everything wasn't okay. Frank Morrison had spent enough years watching kids to know when something was seriously wrong, and whatever was happening to Emma Thompson was getting worse. The afternoon pickup was a mirror image of the morning routine. Emma was always waiting at the same corner, always alone, always with that same defeated posture that made Frank's chest ache. She climbed on, whispered her request for the back seat, and disappeared into her corner like a ghost. Today, though, something was different. As Frank adjusted his mirror, he noticed Emma wasn't sitting in her usual position. Instead of pressing herself against the window, she was hunched forward, her arms wrapped around her middle like she was trying to hold herself together. "Emma," Frank called out, but she didn't respond. The other kids were their usual rowdy selves, completely oblivious to the quiet drama playing out in the back seat. Frank tried to focus on driving, but his eyes kept drifting to the mirror. Emma's shoulders were shaking, and he realized she was crying. Not the dramatic tears of a teenager dealing with friend drama, but the quiet, desperate weeping of someone who had learned that crying too loudly brought unwanted attention. When they reached Emma's stop, she didn't get up. Frank waited, watching as Jake jumped off and jogged toward their house without a backward glance. Still, Emma remained seated. "Emma, honey, this is your stop," Frank called out gently. She lifted her head, and Frank saw that her eyes were red and swollen. Could you maybe drive around the block a few more times? I don't want to go home yet." Frank's heart clenched. In all his years of driving, no kid had ever asked him to delay going home. Kids might dawdle getting off the bus, might drag their feet walking to their front door, but they never asked to stay on the bus. "I wish I could, sweetheart, but I've got other routes to run. District policy, you know." Emma nodded, the disappointment clear on her face. She gathered her backpack and made her way to the front of the bus, moving like every step caused her pain. "Emma," Frank said as she reached the door, "if you ever need someone to talk to, well, I'm here every morning and afternoon, okay?" She looked up at him with those haunted eyes, and for a moment, Frank thought she might actually say something. Instead, she just nodded and stepped off the bus. Frank watched her walk toward the Thompson house, a modest two-story with peeling paint and a front yard that had seen better days. Emma moved slowly, as if she were walking toward her execution rather than her home. She paused at the front door, her hand on the handle, and Frank could see her shoulders rise and fall in what looked like a steadying breath. Then she disappeared inside, and Frank was left with nothing but questions and a growing sense that he was witnessing something terrible unfold in slow motion. That evening, Frank sat in his apartment, nursing a beer and staring at the local news without really seeing it. His wife Margaret had been gone for 3 years now, and the silence of his empty home usually didn't bother him. Tonight, though, the quiet felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of unspoken concerns. He thought about Emma Thompson, about the bruise on her jaw, and the way she'd asked to drive around the block. He thought about her brother Jake, popular and confident, and how the two siblings seemed to exist in parallel universes. Most of all, he thought about the tears he'd seen in his rearview mirror, and the way Emma had braced herself before walking into her own home. Frank had been driving a school bus for more than 2 decades. He'd seen poverty, neglect, and all the ways that life could be unfair to children. But there was something about Emma Thompson that felt different, something that made his protective instincts flare like a match struck in the darkness. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for the school district's main office. His finger hovered over the call button as he debated whether to report his concerns. What would he say? That a kid asked to sit in the back of the bus? That she seemed sad? That she had a bruise that could have come from a dozen different sources? Frank set the phone down without making the call. He needed more than suspicions and gut feelings. He needed proof. But as he sat there in his quiet apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of his own losses and regrets, Frank Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He was going to pay closer attention to Emma Thompson, and if his worst fears were confirmed, he was going to do something about it, district policy be damned. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made Frank's arthritis ache and put the kids in foul moods. He arrived at the bus depot early, as was his habit, and did his pre-trip inspection with the methodical precision of someone who had done it thousands of times before. As he checked the tires and tested the lights, Frank's mind wandered to Emma Thompson. He'd spent half the night thinking about her, about the signs he might have missed and the ones he was only now beginning to recognize, the way she never brought lunch money or seemed to have eaten breakfast, the way her clothes were always wrinkled and often too big, as if they were hand-me-downs from someone much larger, the way she flinched when other kids got too loud or moved too quickly near her. The morning pickup went according to routine until Frank reached the corner of Maple and 3rd. Emma was there, as always, but something was different. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the fact that the October day was shaping up to be unseasonably warm. More concerning, she was favoring her left arm, holding it close to her body as if it pained her. "Morning, Emma," Frank said as she climbed aboard. She mumbled something that might have been a greeting and made her way to the back of the bus. Frank watched in his mirror as she settled into her seat, wincing as she adjusted her position. The sleeve of her shirt rode up slightly, and Frank caught a glimpse of what looked like finger-shaped bruises on her wrist, before she quickly pulled the fabric back down. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd seen enough in his years of driving to know what those kinds of bruises meant. Someone had grabbed Emma Thompson hard enough to leave marks, and Frank was beginning to suspect it wasn't a schoolyard bully. The rest of the morning route passed in a blur. Frank went through the motions of picking up kids and delivering them to school, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about mandatory reporting laws and the number he had memorized for Child Protective Services. He was thinking about the difference between suspicion and evidence, and how much proof he needed before he could act. Most of all, he was thinking about Emma Thompson, sitting in the back of his bus like a wounded bird, and how many more mornings he could watch her suffer in silence before his conscience demanded action. When Frank dropped the kids off at Lincoln Middle School, Emma was once again the last to leave. As she passed his seat, Frank made a decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. "Emma, wait a minute," he said, turning in his seat to face her. She paused, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "I just want you to know," Frank said carefully, "that if you ever need help or if there's something going on at home that you want to talk about, I'm here. Okay? Sometimes adults need to know when kids are in trouble." Emma's face went pale, and she shook her head quickly. "I'm fine, Mr. Morrison. Everything's fine." But her voice was shaking and Frank could see the panic in her eyes. She practically ran off the bus, leaving Frank alone with the terrible certainty that he'd just made everything worse. The days that followed Frank's conversation with Emma were marked by a noticeable change in her behavior. Where she had once been merely withdrawn, she now seemed actively terrified. She no longer made eye contact with Frank when she boarded the bus, and she positioned herself even further back in her seat, as if trying to disappear entirely into the worn vinyl upholstery. Frank cursed himself for his clumsy attempt at reaching out. In his desire to help, he'd likely made Emma feel more isolated than ever. He'd seen it before with kids from troubled homes, the way they shut down when adults started asking questions, protective of secrets that weren't theirs to tell. It was a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after their conversation, when Frank noticed Emma wasn't at her usual stop. He waited the customary 30 seconds, scanning the empty corner where she should have been standing. The October air had turned crisp overnight, and frost glittered on the brown grass of the suburban lawns. "Where's Emma?" asked Sarah Chen, a quiet 7th grader who sometimes sat near Emma in the back. It surprised Frank that anyone had noticed her absence. "Maybe she's sick," Frank replied, though something in his gut told him that wasn't the case. Jake Thompson got on at the next stop as boisterous as ever, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that his sister wasn't on the bus. Frank watched Jake laugh with his friends and felt a surge of anger at the boy's indifference. How could he not notice that his own sister was missing? The morning felt off kilter without Emma's quiet presence in the back seat. Frank found himself checking his rearview mirror out of habit, expecting to see her hunched figure pressed against the window. Instead, he saw only empty seats and the gray October sky through rain-streaked glass. Emma wasn't at the afternoon pickup either. Frank waited longer than he should have, earning annoyed complaints from the other kids who wanted to get home. As he finally pulled away from the empty corner, Frank made a decision that would have horrified his supervisors if they'd known about it. He was going to drive past the Thompson house. Frank took a slight detour on his way back to the depot, turning down Emma Street under the pretense of avoiding construction on his usual route. The Thompson house looked even more run down in the gray afternoon light. The lawn was scattered with fallen leaves that no one had bothered to rake, and one of the front porch steps had partially collapsed, leaving a gaping hole filled with rotting wood. There was a car in the driveway that Frank didn't recognize, a beat-up sedan with rust eating away at its wheel wells. Through the front window of the house, Frank could see the blue flicker of a television, but no other signs of life. He drove past slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. What was he hoping to see? What was he looking for? Frank didn't have answers to those questions, but something deep in his chest told him that Emma Thompson was in that house, and she was in trouble. The next morning, Emma was back at her stop, but Frank barely recognized her. She moved like someone recovering from a serious illness, slow and careful, as if sudden movements might cause her pain. She was wearing a turtleneck sweater despite the fact that the morning was relatively warm, and she kept her arms wrapped around herself as she walked to the bus. "Back seat, please," she whispered when she climbed aboard, but her voice was even fainter than usual, barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Frank watched her in his mirror as she made her way down the aisle. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, and when she sat down, she let out a small gasp that she tried to muffle with her hand. Several of the other kids glanced back at the sound, but they quickly returned to their own conversations. Jake got on 2 stops later, as animated as ever. He was telling his friends about some party he'd been to over the weekend, his voice loud and confident. Frank found himself studying the boy's face, looking for any sign that he was aware of his sister's condition. If Jake knew what was happening to Emma, he showed no indication of it. "Man, you should have seen this one girl," Jake was saying to his friends. "She was totally wasted, couldn't even stand up straight. My mom would have killed me if she'd seen me at that party." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Jake's casual mention of his mother made Frank wonder about the Thompson family dynamic. In all his observations of Emma and Jake, he'd never heard either of them mention their parents. The absence of that normal teenage complaint about mom and dad was now glaringly obvious. At school, Emma was again the last to leave the bus. As she stood up from her seat, Frank saw her wince and grabbed the seat back for support. The movement caused her turtleneck to shift slightly, and Frank caught a glimpse of what looked like a dark bruise on her collarbone before she quickly adjusted her clothing. "Emma," Frank said gently, "are you feeling all right? You look like you might be coming down with something." She looked at him with eyes that seemed decades older than her 14 years. "I'm okay, Mr. Morrison. Just tired." But she wasn't okay, and they both knew it. As Emma walked toward the school building, Frank noticed that she was favoring her right side, moving with the careful gait of someone nursing injured ribs. Frank spent his break between morning and afternoon routes parked outside a coffee shop, staring at his cell phone. He had the number for Child Protective Services saved in his contacts, but every time he started to dial, he hesitated. What proof did he have? Bruises could be explained away. A kid's withdrawn behavior could be attributed to any number of factors. Emma had never actually told him she was being hurt, but Frank had been around long enough to recognize the signs. The way Emma flinched when people moved too quickly, the careful way she positioned herself to avoid physical contact, the bruises in various stages of healing, the clothes that seemed designed to cover as much skin as possible regardless of the weather. Most damning of all was the fear in her eyes, not the normal wariness of a shy teenager, but the deep, bone-level terror of someone who lived in constant anticipation of pain. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from dispatch, reminding him that his afternoon route started in 20 minutes. He put the phone away without making the call, but the weight of his inaction sat heavy in his chest. The afternoon pickup brought another disturbing observation. Emma was waiting at her corner as usual, but Frank noticed a man standing in the doorway of the Thompson house watching. He was tall and lean, with the kind of wiry build that suggested either hard physical labor or something less wholesome. Even from a distance, Frank could see the man's eyes tracking Emma's movement toward the bus. Emma climbed aboard without her usual greeting, her head down and her shoulders hunched. As the bus pulled away, Frank glanced in his side mirror and saw the man still standing in the doorway, still watching. "Who was that guy at your house?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "What guy?" "The man standing in your doorway. I just noticed him when we were pulling away." "I don't know what you mean," Emma said quickly, but her voice was shaking. There wasn't anyone there. Frank didn't push, but he could see Emma's hands trembling as she gripped the straps of her backpack. The fear radiating from her was almost palpable, filling the back of the bus like a toxic fog. When they reached Emma's stop, she didn't immediately get up. Instead, she sat frozen in her seat, staring out the window at her house. Frank could see the man was still there, now standing on the front porch with his arms crossed over his chest. "Emma," Frank called softly. "This is your stop, honey." "I know," she whispered, but she made no move to leave her seat. Frank watched the man on the porch check his watch and take a step toward the street. There was something in his posture, something aggressive and impatient, that made Frank's protective instincts flare. "Is that man someone you're afraid of?" Frank asked, abandoning any pretense of casual concern. Emma's head whipped around to face him, and Frank saw raw terror in her eyes. "Please don't ask me that," she whispered. "Please, Mr. Morrison, I have to go." She stood up abruptly and hurried toward the front of the bus. moving with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing a burning building. As she stepped off the bus, Frank saw the man on the porch straighten up, his attention focused entirely on Emma's approach. Frank didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he pretended to check something on his clipboard while watching through his peripheral vision. The man said something to Emma as she reached the porch, and Frank saw her entire body tense. Then they both disappeared inside the house, and Frank was left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. That night, Frank sat in his apartment with a beer growing warm in his hands, staring at his phone. He'd pulled up the Child Protective Services website and read through their guidelines for reporting suspected abuse. The language was clear. Any adult who suspected a child was being harmed had a legal and moral obligation to report it. Frank had more than suspicions now. He had observations, patterns, and a growing collection of evidence that Emma Thompson was living in hell. The question was no longer whether he should report it, but whether he was already too late. He thought about the man on the porch, about the way Emma had frozen when she saw him. He thought about the bruises he'd been documenting in his mind for weeks, about the way Emma moved like someone expecting pain, about the terror in her eyes when he'd asked simple questions. Frank picked up his phone and dialed the CPS hotline. A woman with a tired voice answered on the third ring. "Child Protective Services, this is Linda." "Hi," Frank said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I need to report suspected child abuse." "Okay, sir. Can you give me your name and relationship to the child?" "Frank Morrison. I'm her school bus driver." "And the child's name?" Frank took a deep breath. "Emma Thompson. She's 14 years old, and I think someone is hurting her." The intake process took nearly an hour. Frank provided every detail he could remember: the bruises, the behavioral changes, the way Emma flinched from contact, the mysterious man at her house. Linda listened patiently, asking clarifying questions and taking careful notes. "We'll open an investigation," Linda said when Frank had finished his report. "Someone will be in contact with the family within 48 hours. "What happens to Emma in the meantime?" Frank asked. "I understand your concern, Mr. Morrison, but we have to follow protocol. The caseworker will assess the situation and determine the appropriate course of action." Frank hung up feeling both relieved and terrified. He'd done his duty as a mandated reporter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that 48 hours might be too long. Emma Thompson had been suffering for months, possibly years, and Frank had just potentially made her situation more dangerous by involving the authorities. He spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd just saved Emma's life or signed her death warrant. The next morning, Frank arrived at the bus depot earlier than usual, anxiety eating at his stomach like acid. He'd barely slept, haunted by visions of what might be happening to Emma while he sat safely in his apartment. The thought that his report to CPS might have triggered an escalation of violence made him physically sick. Emma was at her stop as usual, but Frank could see immediately that something had changed. She moved with even more care than before, and when she climbed onto the bus, Frank noticed that the bruise on her jawline had darkened and spread. There were also small cuts on her hands that hadn't been there the day before. "Back seat," she whispered, but her voice was so faint that Frank had to strain to hear her. As Emma made her way down the aisle, Frank saw several of the other students stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Sarah Chen, the quiet 7th grader who had noticed Emma's absence earlier in the week, actually started to get up from her seat as if to follow Emma to the back of the bus. "Sarah, honey, please stay in your assigned seat," Frank said quickly. The last thing Emma needed was unwanted attention from her peers. Frank watched Emma in his rearview mirror as she settled into her corner. She was moving like someone who had been beaten, careful and slow, and Frank realized with horrifying clarity that his suspicions had been confirmed in the worst possible way. When Jake got on the bus 2 stops later, Frank studied the boy's face for any sign that he was aware of his sister's condition. Jake seemed his usual oblivious self, laughing with his friends and complaining about a history test. Either he was an exceptionally good actor, or he was genuinely unaware that his sister was being systematically brutalized. The possibility that Jake didn't know what was happening to Emma was almost as disturbing as the abuse itself. What kind of family dynamic allowed such violence to occur while other family members remained oblivious? Frank began to suspect that the abuse was being carefully hidden, perpetrated by someone who understood the importance of maintaining appearances. The man on the porch the day before suddenly took on new significance. Frank wondered if he was a boyfriend of Emma's mother, a relative, or perhaps a stranger who had insinuated himself into the family. The possibilities were all equally horrifying. At school, Emma was again the last to leave the bus. As she stood up, Frank saw her grab the seat back for support, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. The cuts on her hands were more visible now, and Frank could see that they were defensive wounds, the kind that came from trying to protect yourself from an attacker. "Emma," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that there are people who care about you, people who want to help." She looked at him with those haunted eyes, and Frank saw something that broke his heart. Gratitude mixed with hopelessness, as if she appreciated his concern but knew it was futile. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she whispered. "You're a good man." Then she was gone, walking toward the school building with that careful, painful gait that Frank had come to associate with her suffering. Frank sat in his empty bus for a long time after Emma disappeared into the crowd of students. He thought about the CPS report he'd filed the night before, about the 48-hour timeline for investigation, about the possibility that his good intentions might have made Emma's situation worse. Most of all, he thought about the gratitude in Emma's eyes and the way she'd called him a good man. Frank didn't feel like a good man. A good man would have acted sooner. A good man would have found a way to protect a child who was clearly in desperate need of protection. Frank Morrison had spent 23 years driving a school bus without ever feeling like he'd failed a child. Today, watching Emma Thompson walk away from his bus with fresh injuries and fading hope, he felt like he'd failed the one who needed him most. The radio crackled to life, breaking him out of his dark thoughts. "Unit 47, you're running behind schedule. What's your status?" Frank picked up the handset with shaking hands. "Sorry, dispatch. Just finishing up at Lincoln, heading to Route 2 now." But as Frank put the bus in gear and pulled away from the school, he made a decision that would change everything. Tonight, after his routes were finished, he was going to drive past the Thompson house again. And if he saw anything at all, that suggested Emma was in immediate danger, he was going to act. Protocol be damned. Frank Morrison had been a rule follower his entire life. But some things were more important than rules. Some things were worth risking everything for. And Emma Thompson, broken and bleeding in the back of his bus, was definitely worth the risk. That evening, Frank Morrison sat in his parked bus 3 blocks away from the Thompson house, watching the sun set behind the suburban rooftops. He'd finished his official routes an hour ago, but instead of returning to the depot, he'd driven to Emma's neighborhood with a knot of dread growing in his stomach. The CPS investigation was supposed to begin within 48 hours of his report, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that Emma didn't have 48 hours. The fresh injuries he'd seen that morning, the defensive wounds on her hands, the way she'd moved like someone who'd been beaten, it all pointed to an escalation that terrified him. Frank pulled out his phone and called the CPS hotline again. The same tired voice answered. "Child Protective Services, this is Linda." "Hi, this is Frank Morrison. I called last night about Emma Thompson. I need to know when someone's going to check on her." "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concern, but I can't give you specific information about case timelines. I can tell you that your report has been assigned to a caseworker and will be investigated according to our standard protocols. She came to school today with fresh injuries," Frank said, his voice rising. "Someone beat her up after I made that report. How long are your standard protocols going to take?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Morrison, if you believe a child is in immediate danger, you should call 911. And tell them what? That I think something bad might be happening? That I have a feeling? I understand your frustration, sir, but we have to follow proper procedures. The caseworker will contact the family tomorrow morning." Frank hung up, his hands shaking with frustration. Tomorrow morning might be too late. Hell, tonight might be too late. He drove slowly past the Thompson house, his heart pounding. The same beat-up sedan was in the driveway, and through the living room window, Frank could see the blue glow of the television. There were 2 silhouettes visible, one large, one small. The larger figure seemed to be gesturing animatedly while the smaller one sat perfectly still. Frank parked around the corner and walked back, staying in the shadows of the overgrown hedges that lined the street. He felt like a criminal, sneaking around someone's neighborhood, but his concern for Emma overrode his discomfort with the situation. As he got closer to the house, Frank could hear voices through the thin walls. The man's voice was loud and angry, though Frank couldn't make out the words. He heard Emma's voice too, high and pleading, and the sound made his blood run cold. Frank crept closer to the living room window, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Emma sitting on a sagging couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. The man Frank had seen on the porch earlier was standing over her, his face twisted with rage. "Told you what would happen if anyone started asking questions," the man was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the window. "But you couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you?" "I didn't say anything," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I swear, Ray, I didn't tell anyone anything." "Ray." Frank filed the name away, his mind racing. This wasn't a family member, at least not one Emma was comfortable with. The way she said his name, with that mixture of fear and desperation, told Frank everything he needed to know about their relationship. "Then why did some social worker call here today asking questions about you?" Ray demanded, grabbing Emma by the shoulders and shaking her. "Why did she want to know about your living situation?" Frank's blood turned to ice. The CPS investigation had already begun, and somehow Ray had found out about it. Worse, he'd connected it to Emma, and now she was paying the price for Frank's attempt to help her. "I don't know," Emma sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Maybe someone at school noticed something. Maybe." Ray's hand shot out, connecting with Emma's cheek with a sound that made Frank flinch. The blow knocked Emma sideways on the couch, and Frank saw her curl into a ball, trying to protect herself from further violence. "Don't lie to me," Ray snarled. "You told someone. You broke the rules, and now you're going to pay for it." Frank's vision went red. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to burst through that window and tear Ray apart with his bare hands. The only thing that stopped him was the knowledge that Emma might get hurt worse in the chaos. Instead, Frank pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hit the numbers. "911, what's your emergency?" "I'm witnessing a domestic violence incident," Frank whispered, trying to keep his voice down. "A man is beating a 14-year-old girl. I need police at 847 Maple Street immediately." "Sir, can you confirm you're witnessing this incident right now?" "Yes, I can see it happening through the window. Please hurry." "Officers are on their way. Can you stay on the line?" Frank was about to respond when he heard a crash from inside the house. Through the window, he saw that Ray had overturned a coffee table, and Emma was cowering against the arm of the couch, her hands raised to protect her face. "Please, Ray," Emma was begging. "I'm sorry. I'll be more careful. I won't let anyone see." "It's too late for that," Ray said, his voice deadly quiet. "They're already asking questions, which means you're becoming a liability." The way he said the word liability made Frank's skin crawl. This wasn't just about abuse anymore. Emma's life was in immediate danger. Frank made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He hung up on the 911 operator and walked to the front door of the Thompson house. His hands were steady now, his mind clear with purpose. He wasn't going to stand by and watch Emma Thompson die while he waited for help to arrive. Frank pounded on the front door, loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. "Police, open up!" The voices inside the house stopped abruptly. Frank could hear movement, whispered conversations, and then footsteps approaching the door. "There's nobody here by that name," came Ray's voice through the door, but Frank could hear the tension in it. "I said police. Open this door now or we're coming in." Frank heard more whispered conversation, and then the sound of a door slamming somewhere in the back of the house. Ray was running, leaving Emma alone, Frank hoped. The front door opened and Emma appeared, her face swollen and tear-streaked. She looked at Frank with confusion and terror. "Mr. Morrison, what are you doing here?" "Getting you out of here," Frank said, stepping into the house without invitation. "Where's Ray?" He left. Through the back door." "Mr. Morrison, you can't be here. If he comes back and finds you." "He's not coming back tonight," Frank said with more confidence than he felt. "Emma, we need to get you to a hospital. You're hurt." "I'm fine," Emma said automatically, but Frank could see she was anything but fine. Her lip was split. There was a fresh bruise forming on her cheek, and she was holding her ribs like they might be cracked. "No, you're not fine, and you're not going to pretend to be fine anymore." Frank heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. The real police were on their way, and Frank was going to have some explaining to do. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he'd done the right thing. "Emma, I need you to listen to me," Frank said gently. "When the police get here, I want you to tell them the truth. All of it. About Ray, about what he's been doing to you, about everything." Emma's eyes went wide with panic. "I can't. You don't understand. If I tell them, he'll kill me. He said he would. He's not going to kill you because he's not going to get near you again. The police are going to arrest him, and you're going to be safe." The sirens were getting closer now, and Frank could see the red and blue lights reflecting off the houses down the street. Emma was shaking, torn between hope and terror. "What about Jake?" she whispered. "What about my mom? Where are they, Emma? Where's your family?" Emma's face crumpled. "Mom's been gone for 6 months. She left with some guy from her work. Jake. Jake doesn't know about Ray. He thinks Ray is just Mom's boyfriend who helps with the rent. He doesn't know what happens when Jake's not here." Frank felt his heart break for this girl who had been carrying such a terrible secret. "Emma, honey, Jake's going to find out eventually. And when he does, he's going to wish he'd known sooner so he could have protected you." The police cars pulled up outside, their sirens wailing. Frank could see uniformed officers getting out, their hands on their weapons as they approached the house. "Mr. Morrison," Emma said, grabbing his arm. "Thank you for everything, for caring enough to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Frank understood. He pulled Emma into a gentle hug, careful not to aggravate her injuries. "You're going to be okay," he whispered. "I promise you, Emma, you're going to be okay." The police officers burst through the front door, their weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them." Frank slowly raised his hands, keeping himself between Emma and the officers. "I'm the one who called 911. This is Emma Thompson, the victim. The perpetrator fled through the back door about 5 minutes ago." The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, paramedics, and social workers. Emma was taken to the hospital, where doctors documented her injuries and confirmed what Frank had suspected. She'd been systematically abused for months. The defensive wounds on her hands, the partially healed ribs, the bruises in various stages of healing all painted a picture of sustained, deliberate violence. Ray Martinez was arrested at a bar 6 miles away, drunk and belligerent. When police searched the Thompson house, they found Emma's bedroom door had a lock on the outside, and there were restraints hidden in Ray's belongings. The scope of Emma's nightmare was even worse than Frank had imagined. Jake Thompson was found at a friend's house, oblivious to what had been happening to his sister. When police told him about the abuse, he broke down completely, consumed by guilt that he hadn't noticed Emma's suffering. Frank sat in the hospital waiting room at 3 a.m, exhausted and emotionally drained. A social worker named Patricia Mills approached him with a cup of coffee and a tired smile. "You saved her life," Patricia said simply. "The doctor said if the abuse had continued much longer, Emma might not have survived it." Frank thought about all the mornings he'd watched Emma get on his bus, all the signs he'd seen but hadn't acted on soon enough. "I should have done something sooner." "You did what you could with the information you had, and when you realized she was in immediate danger, you acted. That's what matters. What happens to her now?" Patricia sat down beside Frank, her expression thoughtful. "Jake is 18 in 2 months. He's petitioning for guardianship of Emma, and given the circumstances, it's likely to be approved. They have an aunt in Columbus who's offered to help them get back on their feet. And Ray? He's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. The charges include child abuse, sexual assault, kidnapping, and a dozen other felonies. He's not getting out anytime soon." Frank felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Emma would be safe. She would have a chance to heal, to recover, to become the person she was meant to be before Ray Martinez had nearly destroyed her. "Can I see her?" Patricia nodded. "She's been asking for you." Frank found Emma in a private room, her injuries cleaned and bandaged. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, but there was something different about her, a lightness that hadn't been there before, as if a crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Mr. Morrison," she said when she saw him, her voice stronger than he'd heard it in months. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Scared," Emma admitted, "but also free. For the first time in so long, I feel free." Frank sat down in the chair next to her bed. "You're going to be okay, Emma. You're going to have a good life. You deserve that." Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "Why did you help me? You could have just not gotten involved. It would have been easier." Frank thought about his answer carefully. "Because everyone deserves someone who cares about them. Everyone deserves someone who will fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. You're a good kid, Emma, and you deserved better than what was happening to you." Tears rolled down Emma's cheeks, but for the first time since Frank had known her, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope for a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. "I'm going to finish school," Emma said suddenly. "I'm going to graduate, and I'm going to college. I'm going to make something of myself." "I know you are," Frank said, and he meant it. "You're stronger than you know, Emma Thompson." As Frank prepared to leave, Emma called out to him one last time. "Mr. Morrison?" When I do graduate, will you come? I know it's still 4 years away, but wild horses couldn't keep me away, Frank promised. And as Frank Morrison walked out of that hospital room, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes, when the system fails and the rules aren't enough, ordinary people have to do extraordinary things. Sometimes, caring about someone means risking everything to save them. Emma Thompson would carry scars from her ordeal for the rest of her life, but she would also carry the knowledge that someone had cared enough to risk everything for her. And that, Frank thought, might make all the difference in the world. 6 months after that terrible night, Frank Morrison sat in his usual spot in the school bus, watching the spring rain streak down his windshield. The route felt different now. Lighter somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was because he no longer carried the weight of Emma Thompson's secret, or maybe it was because he'd learned that sometimes taking action, even when it feels impossible, can change everything. Emma hadn't returned to Lincoln Middle School after her hospitalization. She and Jake had moved to Columbus to live with their aunt, and Emma had enrolled in a new school where nobody knew her story. Frank had received a few updates from Patricia Mills, the social worker who had handled Emma's case. Emma was in therapy, doing well academically and slowly learning to trust again. The corner of Maple and 3rd Street, where Emma used to wait every morning, was now occupied by a new student, a cheerful 8th grader named Marcus, who chatted constantly about baseball and complained about his little sister. It was a normal, healthy kind of teenage angst that Frank had learned not to take for granted. Frank's actions that night had brought scrutiny from the school district. There had been meetings, reviews, and questions about his decision to leave his assigned route and confront an abusive situation without backup. In the end, the district had concluded that while Frank's methods were unorthodox, his intentions were sound, and the outcome had quite literally saved a life. The local newspaper had run a story about the bus driver who had helped rescue an abused student, though they had kept Emma's name out of print to protect her privacy. Frank had been uncomfortable with the attention, insisting that he'd simply done what anyone would have done in his situation. Privately, though, he knew that wasn't true. Too many people had seen Emma's pain and chosen to look away. It was a Tuesday morning in April when Frank's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He was between routes, parked outside a convenience store where he usually grabbed his morning coffee. The message was short and simple. "Mr. Morrison, this is Emma. Would it be okay if I called you sometime? I have something I'd like to tell you. Emma Thompson." Frank stared at the phone for a long moment, his chest tight with emotion. He hadn't heard from Emma directly since that night in the hospital, though he'd thought about her every single day. He quickly typed back, "Of course, Emma. I'd love to hear from you. Call anytime." His phone rang less than 5 minutes later. "Mr. Morrison?" Emma's voice was different, stronger, more confident than he remembered. "Emma, it's so good to hear from you. How are you doing, sweetheart?" "I'm good. Really good, actually. I wanted to call because I have some news." Frank could hear the excitement in her voice, and it made him smile. "What kind of news?" "I'm graduating next month. From 8th grade, I mean. And I wanted to ask, I know it's been a while and I know it's a long drive to Columbus, but would you maybe want to come to my graduation ceremony?" Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Emma, honey, I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Really? You don't have to if it's too much trouble. I know you're busy with work and—" "Emma," Frank interrupted gently. "I told you in that hospital room that wild horses couldn't keep me away when you graduated. I meant it then, and I mean it now." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Frank could hear Emma sniffling. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Emma said, her voice thick with tears. I'm happy. I didn't think I'd ever be happy again, but I am. I have friends now, Mr. Morrison. Real friends who don't know about what happened, but who like me anyway. And my grades are really good. I might even make honor roll." "That's wonderful, Emma. I'm so proud of you. Jake's doing good too. He got accepted to Ohio State and he's going to study social work. He says he wants to help kids like me, kids who don't have anyone to speak up for them." Frank thought about Jake Thompson, the popular, oblivious teenager who had ridden his bus for 2 years without noticing his sister's suffering. The guilt had nearly destroyed him when he'd learned the truth, but it sounded like he was channeling that guilt into something positive. "What about you?" Frank asked. "Have you thought about what you want to do after high school?" "Actually, that's the other thing I wanted to tell you. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think I want to be a teacher. Elementary school, maybe." I want to work with kids who might not have good situations at home. I want to be the kind of adult who notices when something's wrong. Frank felt a surge of pride and admiration for this remarkable young woman. She had survived something that would have broken many adults, and instead of letting it embitter her, she was planning to use her experience to help others. I think you'd make an excellent teacher, Emma. Really? You think so? I know so. You have something that can't be taught. You understand what it's like to feel invisible, to need someone to care. That's going to make you incredibly good at reaching the kids who need it most. They talked for another 20 minutes, and Frank was amazed by the transformation in Emma's voice and demeanor. She laughed easily, told him about her favorite classes, complained about a boy in her algebra class who kept trying to ask her to the 8th grade dance. She sounded like a normal, healthy teenager, something Frank had never thought he'd hear. Mr. Morrison? Emma said as their conversation was winding down. Yes, sweetheart? I need you to know that what you did, it didn't just save my life. It gave me my life back. Before that night, I thought I was going to die in that house. I thought that was all I was ever going to be. Ray's victim. But you showed me that there were people who cared. People who would fight for me even when I couldn't fight for myself. Frank had to pull over because his vision was blurred with tears. Emma, you saved yourself. You survived something terrible and you came out stronger. That's all you. Maybe, Emma said. But I couldn't have done it alone. I needed someone to see me, really see me, and care enough to do something about it. You were that person for me. After they hung up, Frank sat in his parked bus for a long time, thinking about the conversation and about the journey that had brought them to this point. He thought about all the mornings when Emma had climbed onto his bus, silent and hurting, and how many times he'd almost convinced himself that it wasn't his place to get involved. He thought about the night he'd stood outside the Thompson house, watching through the window as Ray hurt Emma, and how close he'd come to just calling 911 and walking away. What if he had? What if he'd decided that he'd done his duty as a mandated reporter and left it at that? The thought made him shudder. Emma might not have survived that night. At best, she would have endured months more abuse while the system slowly, bureaucratically worked its way toward a solution. Frank's radio crackled to life, breaking him out of his thoughts. Unit 47, you're needed for afternoon pickup in 15 minutes. Copy that, dispatch. On my way. As Frank drove toward his next route, he found himself paying closer attention to the kids who climbed onto his bus. There was a quiet 6th grader named Tyler, who always sat alone and never seemed to have lunch money. There was a girl named Ashley who flinched whenever anyone raised their voice. There was a boy named David whose clothes always looked like he'd slept in them. Frank had always noticed these things, but Emma's situation had taught him to look deeper, to ask harder questions, to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. He made mental notes about each child, watching for patterns, looking for signs that someone might need help. 3 weeks later, Frank found himself driving to Columbus on a Saturday morning, his best suit hanging in the back of his car, and a small wrapped gift on the passenger seat. Emma's graduation ceremony was at 10 o'clock, and Frank had left early to make sure he arrived on time. The middle school was larger than Lincoln, a sprawling brick building surrounded by well-maintained athletic fields and playgrounds. Frank parked in the visitors' lot and made his way to the gymnasium, where families were already gathering for the ceremony. He spotted Emma almost immediately. She was standing near the front of the room with a group of other students, wearing a royal blue cap and gown that made her look older than her 14 years. Her blonde hair, which had always hung limp and lifeless when Frank knew her, was now clean and styled, catching the light from the gymnasium's fluorescent fixtures. But it was Emma's posture that struck Frank the most. Gone was the hunched, defensive stance he remembered. Instead, she stood straight and tall, laughing at something one of her friends had said. She looked confident, healthy, alive in a way that brought tears to Frank's eyes. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Morrison?" Frank turned to see a tall, lanky young man with familiar features. It took him a moment to recognize Jake Thompson, who had filled out and matured considerably in the past 6 months. "Jake, it's good to see you." Jake pulled Frank into an unexpected hug. "Thank you for coming. Emma's been talking about this for weeks. She was so worried you might not be able to make it. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. How are you doing, son?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Better. A lot better. Therapy helps, and staying busy with school keeps my mind off the guilt. I'm trying to focus on the future, on how I can make sure what happened to Emma doesn't happen to other kids. Emma mentioned you're studying social work. Yeah, I figure I owe it to her, you know? I lived in the same house and never noticed what was happening. Maybe I can't fix that, but I can make sure I never miss the signs again." Before Frank could respond, Emma appeared at Jake's side, her face lighting up when she saw Frank. "Mr. Morrison, you came." Frank found himself enveloped in another hug, this one from Emma herself. She felt solid and strong in his arms, nothing like the fragile, broken girl he remembered from the hospital. "Of course I came. I told you I would." Emma pulled back, her eyes bright with tears. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you a letter, but I was too nervous to mail it. I thought maybe I could give it to you in person." Frank accepted the letter, but before he could open it, a voice over the loudspeaker announced that the ceremony was about to begin. Emma squeezed his hand and hurried back to her place with the other graduates. Frank found a seat in the bleachers next to Jake and Jake's aunt, a kind-faced woman named Susan, who welcomed Frank like family. As the ceremony began, Frank unfolded Emma's letter and began to read. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I've started this letter 100 times, and I can never find the right words to say what I want to say. How do you thank someone for saving your life? How do you thank someone for caring about you when you couldn't care about yourself? 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I was going to die in that house, and honestly, there were days when I wanted to. I felt so alone, so hopeless, so invisible. I thought nobody would ever notice if I just disappeared. But you noticed. You saw me when I thought I was invisible. You cared about me when I thought I was worthless. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. You saved me, Mr. Morrison. In every way a person can be saved. I know what you did that night was dangerous. I know you could have gotten in trouble with your job, or worse. But you did it anyway because you thought I was worth saving. Nobody had ever thought I was worth saving before. I'm graduating today because of you. I'm going to high school because of you. I'm going to college because of you. I'm going to become a teacher and help other kids because of you. Everything good that happens in my life from now on happens because you decided that Emma Thompson mattered. I will never forget what you did for me. I will never forget that when I needed a hero, you were there. I will never forget that sometimes when everything seems hopeless, there are still good people in the world who will do the right thing, even when it's hard. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for caring. Thank you for saving me. Love, Emma P.S. I kept my promise. I'm graduating with honors." Frank had to wipe his eyes several times while reading the letter. When he looked up, the principal was announcing the honor roll students, and Emma's name was among them. She walked across the stage with her head held high, accepting her certificate with a smile that could have powered the entire building. After the ceremony, Frank spent another hour with Emma and her family. He met Emma's friends who were clearly fond of her, and completely unaware of the darkness in her past. He talked with Susan about Emma's plans for high school and her dreams of becoming a teacher. He watched Emma laugh and joke with Jake. Their sibling relationship clearly healed and stronger than ever. When it was time for Frank to leave, Emma walked him to his car. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I have one more favor to ask. Anything. When I graduate from high school in 4 years, will you come to that ceremony too?" Frank smiled. "Try and stop me. And when I graduate from college, I'll be there. And when I get my first teaching job, Emma, honey, you're stuck with me. I'm going to be cheering you on for the rest of your life." Emma hugged him one more time, and Frank was struck by how different this hug felt from the ones in the hospital 6 months ago. This wasn't the desperate embrace of someone clinging to hope. This was the confident hug of someone who knew she was loved and supported. As Frank drove back toward home, he thought about the long journey that had brought them to this point. He thought about all the mornings when Emma had climbed onto his bus, silent and suffering, and how close they'd all come to a very different ending. He thought about the phone call he'd almost not made to CPS, about the night he'd almost decided not to check on Emma, about all the moments when he'd almost chosen to look the other way. How many kids were sitting in the back of buses right now waiting for someone to notice their pain? How many Emmas were out there, believing they were invisible, hoping someone would care enough to save them? Frank made a mental promise to himself as he drove through the Ohio countryside. He would never stop looking. He would never stop noticing. He would never stop caring about the kids who rode his bus, especially the ones who tried to make themselves invisible, because sometimes, Frank had learned, the most important thing you can do for someone is simply to see them, to notice their pain, to care about their welfare, to refuse to let them disappear into the shadows. Emma Thompson had taught him that lesson in the most profound way possible. She had shown him that sometimes, When you save someone else, you save a part of yourself too. As Frank Morrison drove home from Emma's graduation, he carried with him the knowledge that he had made a difference, that when it mattered most, when a child's life hung in the balance, he had chosen courage over comfort, action over apathy, and somewhere in Columbus, a remarkable young woman was beginning the next chapter of her life, a life full of possibility and hope, a life that existed because someone had cared enough to notice her pain and brave enough to do something about it. The road stretched out ahead of Frank, familiar and comforting, leading him home. But he knew that tomorrow morning he would climb into his bus again, and he would watch for the children who needed someone to see them. Because that's what heroes do. They show up, day after day, ready to notice the invisible and fight for those who can't fight for themselves. And Frank Morrison, school bus driver and reluctant hero, would never stop showing up. 4 years later, Frank kept his promise and attended Emma's high school graduation. She graduated valedictorian, delivered a speech about the importance of noticing others, and announced her intention to study elementary education at Ohio State University. 8 years later, Frank was there when Emma graduated summa cum laude with her teaching degree. By then, she had started a nonprofit organization dedicated to training school personnel to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. 12 years later, Frank attended the ceremony where Emma received a national award for her work with at-risk children. She had become exactly the kind of teacher she dreamed of being, one who noticed the invisible kids who fought for the ones who couldn't fight for themselves. And in her acceptance speech that night, Emma Thompson, now Emma Thompson Miller, married to a fellow teacher and mother to 2 young children, told the story of a bus driver who had refused to look away when a child needed help. Heroes, she said, looking directly at Frank in the audience, aren't the people who wear capes or have superpowers. Heroes are the people who see suffering and choose to act. Heroes are the people who notice when someone needs help and refuse to walk away. Heroes are the people who understand that sometimes saving one person can change the world. Frank Morrison had learned that lesson from a quiet 14-year-old girl who had asked to sit in the back of his bus, and for the rest of his life, he would carry the knowledge that sometimes the most important journeys happen not on the roads we travel, but in the connections we make with the people who need us most. The story of Emma Thompson and Frank Morrison became the story that reminded everyone who heard it that heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they're teachers, sometimes they're social workers, sometimes they're neighbors or friends, and sometimes they're school bus drivers who refuse to let a child disappear into the shadows, who understand that every person matters, and who are brave enough to act when action is needed most. In the end, that's what heroes really are. Ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when someone else's life depends on it. And the world is a better place because people like Frank Morrison exist. People who believe that every child deserves someone who will fight for them, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when it means risking everything. Because some things, some people, are worth the risk. This powerful story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most unexpected places. Frank Morrison's courage to act when a child needed help most shows us that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can save a life and change everything. What did you think of Emma and Frank's incredible journey? Have you ever witnessed someone who made a difference by simply refusing to look away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories of everyday heroes or moments when someone's kindness changed your life. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories that celebrate the power of human compassion. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that remind us we all have the power to be someone's hero. Thank you for watching, and remember, you never know whose life you might change just by caring enough to notice.